Good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Mugge. I'm from the Political Science Department of the University of Amsterdam. And given that this feels at least like the first sunny evening that we've had in the city for the past half year, it's an enormous pleasure to see that so many of you have still made it over here rather than succumbing to the temptation of one of the many beautiful terraces out here. We do offer free drinks afterwards, so there will be a reward. Tonight we'll be speaking about the rising and diffusing artificial intelligence in our societies and corporate concentration, and basically asking ourselves the question whether that's a problem, if so, why? If it is a problem, what could and should be done about it? And as a background to this evening that we're having here today, I lead a research project at the University of Amsterdam that's called Regulate, that investigates European AI policy, how European Commission, the European Parliament, the European Council somehow tries to get a grip on artificial intelligence in a way that makes it a force for good in our societies. Sometimes it seems an uphill struggle. And part of that struggle has to do with the fact that this sector seems to be dominated by an increasingly small and powerful number of companies. Now, before we dig into that, I must say that even though I have the honor of standing here tonight, this event was made possible by a whole range of different people. And I do want to make sure that I thank all of those who have been involved in putting this onto the stage. That is first and foremost my colleague and co-organizer, Levi Sari, who's hiding right there behind the column. So you can't see him, but you'll see him afterwards at the drinks. Also the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, which kindly sponsors this, SPUI 25, the debate center of the University of Amsterdam, and our colleague Fatima Kamal in particular, but also the Critical Infrastructures Lab at the University of Amsterdam, which has also supported on this. So thanks to everybody who's helped us make this possible. As you have maybe also noticed, you see, and I'll introduce them in a minute, the names of our speakers here. There used to be one additional person, Corinne Kath from the Technical University Delft. Unfortunately, she fell ill with the flu yesterday, so she can't join us, but sends her regards. Unfortunately, she can't be here. Now, as I said, the Regulate project that I lead at the University of Amsterdam is primarily concerned with artificial intelligence, and I'm sure that many of you have come across in newspapers, in the internet, elsewhere, concerns that people have about artificial intelligence, whether that concerns autonomous weapons, automated discrimination, a general dumbing down of high school students because everybody only uses ChatGPT all the time, these sorts of things. But there's been an interesting fusion over the past years with concerns about artificial intelligence on the one hand and concerns about big tech, for lack of a better word, on the other hand. Where if you go to Brussels these days, there's a pretty strong conversation going on about whether it is or isn't a problem that Microsoft is so prominent, that Google is so prominent, other large tech companies. Right, so these two conversations have sort of fused to the degree where there is a concern about big tech and AI. This fusion has become bigger because a number of these big American tech companies have really made, if not dominance of AI, but then certainly mastery of AI, a centerpiece of their corporate strategies. You may remember that Meta, for example, the company that owns Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, not too long ago, poured billions and billions of dollars into the metaverse, a virtual space that was, according to Mark Zuckerberg, supposed to be the next frontier in everything that's digital. Now, for all intents and purposes, it appears that he has pulled the plug on this whole idea and instead redirected all the money that's available towards artificial intelligence. And the same is true for many other of these companies. Microsoft, of course, teaming up effectively with OpenAI, the creators of ChatGPT, and the same is true for many other companies there. Now, just to illustrate how much of an issue this corporate concentration is, let me quickly give you the list of the 6 largest companies worldwide by market capitalization, those that are traded on stock exchanges. Those are in order from 1 to 6, Microsoft, Apple, NVIDIA, the chip maker, Alphabet, the owner of Google, Amazon, and Meta. The world's largest companies from 1 to 6, Microsoft, Apple, NVIDIA, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta. The first non-American company that you get in this list stands at number 9. That's TSMC, a Taiwanese company that makes computer chips, right? That's the next one in line. The first time that a company managed to achieve a market valuation of above $1 trillion was 6 years ago, in 2018. That was Apple then. Right now we have 6 companies that are above $1 trillion, the 6 that I just mentioned. And Microsoft by now actually has a valuation of more than $3 trillion. That's compared to 6 years ago when it was comfortably below $1 trillion. So that's more than a tripling of stock market value within 6 years. I mean, imagine what any Microsoft shares would be worth now had you bought them then. I didn't, full disclosure. Now, as I said, the problem that we want to tackle is that a problem? Right, many people, and again, full disclosure, I'm one of them, somehow worry about this ascendancy of big tech, certainly in the combination with AI. But when I'm pushed as to why exactly that's a problem, then maybe I start soul searching a little bit and, sometimes am in this way of thinking about it and then at another moment think about it quite differently. So with a panel of experts that we're super happy to have here today, I want to explore those questions. Is concentration a problem in big tech and AI? If so, why? And what could or should be done about it? So I'm happy to invite to the stage Willy Ledonvirta from the Oxford Internet Institute, and also from Aalto University. Willy, feel free to join me here on the stage. Yeah, we'll just like slowly. There's, yes. Now, the Oxford Internet Institute is a multidisciplinary social science institute, but of course, as the name says, concerned with all things digital, starting with the internet, but I guess having branched out now. And when I asked Willy how he would describe himself, there was something like political economist / economic sociologist of big tech. I guess that sort of sums it up. Then next we have my colleague from the University of Amsterdam, Andrea Leiter. Andrea Leiter is at the law faculty here. Even though she is an international lawyer, but then she immediately told me not to say that she was an international lawyer, because then people think that she has to do with war and peace, and that's not what she does. So you're an international private lawyer of sorts. But I think particularly interested in questions that revolve around international private law and the intersection with techno and crypto technologies and these sorts of things. And last but not least, my colleague from the University of Helsinki, Matti Ylönen. Matti, welcome. Matti is a global political economist who has studied a whole range of things that have to do with political economy, including taxation, and then for quite a few years, the influence of large companies and lobbying of large companies on government policy. You've just come over here fresh from Brussels, where you spent several weeks trying to figure out what big tech actually does or doesn't do in Brussels, so we look forward to that. The format that we had in mind for tonight is the following. I had asked each of our 3 guests here tonight to maybe share in 8 minutes or something per person their thoughts about the questions that I've outlined. Is corporate concentration tech a problem, and AI specifically? If so, why? Then afterwards, I'll interrogate them a little bit about these things. We'll also see where there is agreement or maybe disagreement. And we've, of course, reserved the last half hour of tonight. We'll stop at 9:30 sharp for questions and comments from your side. So count on me that by 9 o'clock I'll open the floor to you. Before we do that, however, we'll simply go in alphabetical order, and that means that we start with you, Willy. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts on this.
Thank you. I suppose because we're streaming out to be using this. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Oh, great to be here. So I wanted to talk about why did we end up with big tech in the first place. I think that we first have to understand what led us where we are now before we can understand to what extent it's a problem and how might we combat it. Who was on the internet in the 90s? Yeah, okay, a lot of very experienced net heads here. So the first thing can you guess what's the first thing that I bought on the internet? Any guesses? Yeah. Not drugs. The first e-commerce transaction in the history of the e-commerce was drugs, because some MIT students bought weed from Stanford students online in the 70s. But I just bought some games in the early 90s. I was a nerd. And I bought games from some guy in Oregon, I think, and I just sent like a check to him, and he could have just kept that money, but instead, and there's nothing I could have done about it, but instead he sent me the games as promised. And that worked because if he hadn't done that, then his reputation in that community would have been spoiled and he couldn't have done business anymore. And so the early internet was this anarchy that sort of worked, right? There was a netiquette, there was a code of conduct that everyone stuck to voluntarily out of their self-interest. But then when the internet started to scale up, hundreds of millions of people started joining the internet from 93 onwards. The commercial internet revolution started. These old informal mechanisms of maintaining social order, they did not keep up with the growth. Spam started appearing, fraud started appearing, scams, all kinds of bad actors exploiting the people's originally trusting attitude towards other internet users. And by towards the end of the 90s, buying something online was considered an extremely risky proposition. You're definitely going to get scammed if you buy something online from some anonymous person. Definitely don't give out your credit card number. Like, the idea of giving out your credit card number online was just ridiculous in the late 90s. And fast forward to today, and everyone's using credit cards. Everyone's just doing business online. So how's that possible? Because in the late 90s, Jeff and Mackenzie Bezos founded Amazon. Piero Mediar founded eBay. Hello. Later on, Apple introduced the App Store. All these big platform companies, they started out small, and they said, come within our walled gardens. We will register you into our databases. We will monitor you. We will impose rules on you. But we will protect you against scammers and spammers and bad actors. So they imposed order on the anarchy that was the late 90s internet. Business thrived. Consumers liked it. They grew into multi-billion-dollar businesses. And in this way, the internet sort of recapped the past 3,000 years of economic history, where our economies have moved from informal barter between people who know each other to organized markets underpinned by the authority and coercion, when necessary, of organized authorities. And this is basically the story of this book called Cloud Empires, which I published recently. But so the point is that we ended up with these tech giants for good reasons. They instilled order. But now they are abusing that powerful position that they have by spying on us, by increasing the taxes that they collect from the markets. And they're also colluding with their governments, whether it's the US tech giants or Chinese tech giants, and their, let's say, national security authorities, which are using them as a means of exerting infrastructural power, of spying and of effecting blockades around the world. And so this has then led to these questions about digital sovereignty. And as long as we're friends with the Americans, this works out very well for us. But what if the man in the White House changes? Are we still happy to be running our societies on U.S. infrastructure? We also don't want to be run them on Chinese infrastructure, and so on. And I won't now in my opening remarks go into, well, what to do about it, but I will say that the reflex in some ways has been that, well, let's introduce competition. Let's make, instead of having big techs, let's have lots of small techs competing against each other. But the story I just told you was one in which this big Leviathan was necessary in order to instill order by coercion if necessary. the situation where many players are competing against each other and nobody has ultimate authority, that was the situation of anarchy in which the early internet lived and which did not scale up to the present size. So my point is the competition-based approaches, unfortunately, I think are not going to solve the issue. And then, since I have 1 minute, I'll make a more explicit link to AI. So we have the same kind of concentration now happening in AI. And partly it's because it's not just the platforms and services that are concentrated, but increasingly also the ownership of the physical infrastructures that underpin the digital world, the data centers, the graphic processing units that train and run the AI models. And one of the reasons why the ownership of those is so concentrated, basically to just Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Meta, and Alibaba, Tencent, and Huawei to some extent in China, is that there are massive economies of scale to be obtained from running computation in larger units as opposed to small units, lots of servers in every company's basement versus one really huge mega hyperscale data center. It's just more energy efficient as well. So paradoxically, the imperative to fight the climate emergency and to increase our energy efficiency might at the same time be promoting a different type of crisis, that of concentration of computation and therefore political power into ever smaller number of hands. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Billy. I already have a host of questions right here. So we need big tech and small tech is actually not so beautiful. That's an interesting provocation. But before I'll go into it, and we'll go into it, Andrea, what's your take on corporate concentration and everything around it?
Excellent. First, I have to thank Willy for the timer here. Okay, excellent, that works. Great. Well, I mean, thank you very much. I think I can go in with two, a long durée and a short durée pickup of your exposure of the history of the internet. The very short version would be look into crypto, and you have this phenomenon condensed into, let's say, even less years than you would draw out the history of the internet now, with a similar attempt of trying to reinvigorate the early days of the internet, to being co-opted, to being in the hands of some few, the absence of regulation and all the uglinesses. So this is sometimes how the blockchain and crypto world is looked at, and there are some similarities, but there is in a funny way, I think, also a very long durée picture which I bring, and now I am the international lawyer after all, because I think this sense of the absence of the decision-making, the big leviathan, is something that from an international legal perspective we have been living with for the longest time now. So this decentralized idea of a system based on reciprocity is something that we know from state governance, and maybe now War and Peace does play a role in this. But just to say, I think there are these two kinds of ways of thinking about the scale of what happens if you have a bottom-up system in which you have an absence of a concentrated regulatory decision maker, and we have analogies to think with that. And I think that what I would like to put on the table, in a sense, is that in this question of the concentration of corporate power, the immediate reflex is usually to say the state is being weakened, no? The state is being hollowed out, and the state comes to the fore as the representative of the public good, of everything that can stand against corporations. And it's the only thing where we would locate the power for an alternative. And I think that that is something, again, speaking from the history of international law, it's a very dangerous proposition in many ways. The proximity between state and corporate power has historically been extremely strong, and if you look specifically from a perspective of the global south, you would see that most of exactly what we see now, also the idea of controlling commanding heights, energy, oil. If you look into the history of oil, you have a strong combination of Western governments and Western companies going around the world imposing their rules and thereby making a very profitable scheme for themselves. But I would say that for many people, banking on the state to come to their rescue has been a very poor proposition so far. And so this is something where I think for me, I do research on blockchain and on the so-called crypto world. And the fascination for me in that space was precisely because it came across, and this is a part of it. No, there are many problems with the world of blockchain and many scams with it, but the proposition that it came with was to say there's something like a third way. It's not a corporation, it's not a state, it's a community of people doing things by a protocol, which again brings us back to the question of what's the rule and how do we do rules from bottom up. It's a protocol rule that allows people to organize themselves in ways that they choose to. So one of the magic tricks, or two of the magic tricks, are you don't need a legal corporate form to start something collectively. No, I mean, if we all here together were to decide that we want to do something together with money, we want to make decisions about how we fund things, if you do it with crypto, you don't need a corporate form. You can simply do it, and then of course the question of how will law relate to you comes later, but you can start doing that. You also don't need a bank account. You don't need to go to the bank and say, we please need an account in which we have 100 people who can make decisions according to these rules, and that's how we go. No bank would ever grant that. So there is a question of where is civil society in the discussions around the concentration of power in big tech. I'm not saying crypto is the solution to it, but I think it's one of the strongest propositions of forging an alternative between the state and corporates. And in that sense, I think we need to think about how do we relate to that. And if we come to an infrastructure level, one of the questions I'd be curious to hear from all of you tonight is really how deep do you have to go in order to reclaim something like an actual authority, sovereignty, or something that could communally be held? Where do you, I mean, data centers are so concentrated, the infrastructure is so concentrated, so is it even enough if you can run some kind of token model where at the end of the day you still rely on the same infrastructure? So I think it's a interesting discussion, and I would leave it at this as just opening this twofold dichotomy into more.
All right, excellent. Mattia, I might go over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, and very interesting opening statements so far as well. So in the past year, I have been conducting nearly 60 interviews in Brussels on the power of the biggest tech firms in the European Union. And this, this research, it's still ongoing. So what I'm going to be speaking, it's drawing from the kind of like the collective insights from my interviewees. And I'm sure I will learn more about this in the future as well. So I got interested in studying how the big five firms, those big five American firms that have been mentioned here, how they try to influence the European Union and whether they are successful in it. When I saw these journalistic accounts on the vastly increased advocacy budgets of these big tech firms in Brussels. So there was these media reports of the collective spending on these lobbying expenses by the big five firms tenfolding between 2013 and 2022 from 3 million to 30 million. And that is a lot of money. I mean, you can do a lot with that money collectively in the Brussels tech circles and advocacy circles, but it's really a pocket money for these big companies, as we just heard about their market valuations, and their turnovers are also very, very significant. So now the question emerges of whether they have actually managed to get a tenfold of influence in the Brussels with that greatly heightened investment in advocacy efforts. And the answer is a bit complicated. My answer is in two parts. So first of all, I make an argument that perhaps in some sense they have gotten less influence than one might expect with that kind of massive upscaling of resources. But then I will conclude by mentioning one area where they might have been actually more influential than we might think. So my interviewees, they have been talking about this perhaps a bit naive kind of thinking about the big tech firms and American tech firms in the early 2000s. I mean, that was a period of this tech optimism in Europe, and we were getting free services like Google Maps or social media platforms and so on, or at least seemingly free. Of course, our data was then the product there. But then came 2016, and things started to change. So Cambridge Analytica scandal happened then. I'm sure many of you remember it, but just as a refresher, it involved the kind of selling of the user data, or harvesting and selling of the user data of tens of millions of Facebook users by this private consultancy firm, which were then used for targeting advertisements in the US presidential elections as well as in the Brexit vote. And some of my interviews have actually also been speaking of the significance of the Brexit vote as well, which does not get that much attention in these discussions when compared to Cambridge Analytica, because the UK traditionally in the European Union has been pushing for this kind of more deregulatory stances in tech regulation, and after the UK left the European Union, the dynamics changed. So you had on the one hand kind of more hostile environment because of Cambridge Analytica and kind of changing attitudes towards big tech, and then kind of changing kind of voting map of the Europe as well, and political discussions in the European Union. So big tech responded to this kind of more hostile environment with these massive new investments in advocacy efforts. So with that money, they have upscaled their presence in Brussels, both kind of in-house lobbyists as well as hiring expertise from various sources, and kind of acquiring knowledge, both thematical knowledge and procedural knowledge on how to navigate these tech circles in Brussels. And some companies, for example, Microsoft, have a longer history in advocating policy in the European Union than some others, let's say Amazon or Google. So there are also differences between these firms. So where has this money gone? Okay, to many different sources. So first, you have more in-house lobbyists. The biggest of these companies, it's in 2 figures, it's not in 3 figures, but nevertheless, it's much more than many small companies. They have perhaps one person, or maybe no one, maybe they just rely on the industry organizations and trade organizations. Then they have actually been funding these industry and trade organizations as well. So that has been a big phenomenon for some of these firms. And then they have also acquired outside expertise, various consultancy firms, whether it's legal consultancies or public affairs consultancies, public relations, and so on. And then fourth, they have been funding various external actors, like think tanks, for example, but also different kind of sponsoring programs for the media, for academics as well, different targeted grants and partnerships and so on, and then advertising in traditional media and social media. So when some of these key discussions were ongoing on these key acts in Brussels, you could see like the Brussels metro stations and airport flooded with advertisements from Google and others, as well as targeted social media advertising on different social media platforms. So through these different channels, the big tech companies have managed to kind of triangulate EU decision-making from many different angles. But however, the question of whether they have actually really made a big impact in the Brussels legislation, that's a bit of an open question. And one of my interviewees put it so that some of the American CEOs, they have this sort of let's kill the bill mentality that they have acquired from Washington, D.C., where it is sometimes possible to kill the bill, so to speak. Whereas in the European Union, when the Commission proposal gets out, it would be very, very unusual if it wouldn't get legislated, maybe in a greatly watered down form, but in any case. And there's also risks in this kind of upscaling of advocacy efforts, because that has also started to irritate many decision makers, and we have seen scandals like Uber files, for example, to massive data leaks related to Uber's advocacy efforts. But I conclude with the one area where they may have been a bit better than we anticipate, and that is kind of like the knowledge production around tech policy in the European Union. So through this funding to different think tanks and different organizations and even academics, I mean, they wield a quite significant influence at the time when the number of policy questions surrounding this tech policy has massively expanded. And there is only a limited number of think tanks and academics and civil society organizations with the interest and possibilities to influence these discussions, and quite many of them do some kind of cooperation with these firms. And as the European Parliament elections are now looming, this is one area where it would be possible for both the EU and the member states to also support these forms of critical knowledge production. But I conclude here. So, thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much. So one thing that I didn't hear you talk about so much is whether you think concentration is a problem, and if so, why? So maybe in a first quick round, I'd still want to push all three of you to tell me, is it a problem? Or is it maybe actually not so much a problem? Willi, you said, for example, yeah, but then they started abusing their authority, and that's kind of where things went south. Sounds to me like if they don't abuse their authority, them being the big techs, then maybe actually it's fine. So is it a problem? If so, why? And I'd like to hear from all three of you quickly, like what the real pain points are.
Quickly, I guess I would say that concentration per se is not usually a problem. Like in some places, like let's say water networks or any other infrastructure, actually we like concentration because it delivers a lot of efficiency and scale economies. The problem comes if the people who own and control that concentrated infrastructure are not accountable to the people who actually use it. And that's when it becomes problematic.
Okay. Like I have many comebacks to this, but I'll first want to hear from the two of you.
Yes, I mean, I think that concentration, I think in general, as a logic of governance is not a problem, but concentration of power, yes, is a problem, because I think that by definition it gets you away from the base. Like the more you concentrate, I think the more layers you are up and the less in touch you are with the base. So I think that in that sense it is, and I would add to that, concentration of power in corporate hands also means that there is a very clear logic that governs the decision-making of corporates. No, and I mean, it's always cheap to say they're only after profit, but to a certain degree, that is true. So the decision-making is based on how can whatever X reward be given to shareholders from the operations. And in that sense, if the concentration is in few corporate hands, then we have a problem at hand with that.
Okay, let me quickly jump in there, though. Adam Smith, back in the days, made the argument that basically, he didn't put in quite those words, but that greed was good because that is what incentivized people to try to make products that would appeal to consumers, right? So if you want to earn money, well, then you bake the nicer bread, then you make the more durable car, then you write the better book, right? So does the interest of companies to earn money, does it necessarily stand in the way of them providing stuff that's actually good for people or in line with their interests? So is it the profit motive that's the problem, or is it the concentration that's the problem?
So, I mean, mini quickly, I would say the concentration is something that really tends to have a monopolizing structure where the profit motive can become so dominant and out of check that you have in the combination of the profit motive and the concentration, you will have a situation in which the reward can be ginormous. There's no baseline against it anymore. And I think in tech, you have that problem.
Okay. How do you feel about why is it a problem, and if so, why?
Yeah, if you look at like the post-World War II decades, I mean, there was a massive kind of conflict between labor and capital, At that time, it was kind of like we had like the labor movement, and then we had capital owners or companies and so on, and it was kind of like more symmetrical. And the thing that has characterized like this whole globalization era is that these kinds of power relations have become much more asymmetrical. And I think we are seeing kind of acceleration of that phenomenon, that there are these new power centers emerging, like in these digital platforms, but we don't have a symmetrical kind of counterpower to them. And that really underlines the kind of like the importance of supporting these basic checks and balances in our society, whether it's the media that is really struggling with these digital platforms and their kind of monetization models, or whether it's kind of long-term work into academia, civil society organizations and so on. I was just last Monday, I was in a seminar in Brussels on this kind of Rebalancing Europe manifesto of civil society organizations. It's quite interesting read. You can look it up on Google if you want. But yeah, I mean, it was a room full of like, I don't know, 40 people or so, and those were, of course, somewhere missing and somewhere online. But I mean, that was quite large part of the civil society in these circles, in these tech circles in Europe. And that tells you something.
So on this issue of counterpower, we're used to thinking that, well, the counterpower to corporate power comes from the state. But now we live in this situation where state, by definition, is a territorially organized political entity. And yet these companies in the digital world, almost by definition, they're deterritorial in the sense that they operate across many different jurisdictions, and then the ability of any particular territorial jurisdiction to hold them accountable is really limited. Or even if we succeed in that, like, you know, if Brussels is able to pass legislation that has such a strong effect that it ends up governing the entire digital world globally, the so-called Brussels effect, coined by Anu Bradford, then can we honestly think that we here in Europe have the means to govern the entire world in its advantage? I think people in many parts of the world already have experience of being governed by Europeans, and they'd rather not have that again. And so I'm interested, for that reason, I'm interested, a little like you, in non-state forms of counterpower. And one that I've studied is what I call the digital middle class, the small businesses, entrepreneurs, app developers, online merchants, professional gamers, streamers, OnlyFans models, anyone who's making money online in the digital economy, but is not one of the platform aristocrats, realizes that they are in a position where they have their entire income is constantly at threat of being taken away by a change in the rules of the platform or of the AI. And they are starting to organize into these collectives. Sometimes they even call them guilds, just like the medieval version, in order to push back against these tech aristocrats. So I think and they are not territorially organized. They may be the business users of a particular platform all around the world coming together and saying, let's campaign to protect our interests against Jeff Bezos, for instance.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you were kind of focusing on this kind of one-person companies, I guess, or OnlyFans or Uber drivers or so on. What I found interesting is that kind of many smaller companies that may have some employees as well, but they are totally unable to have any say in, for example, in these Brussels debates because they don't have any lobbying power, or even if they are a member of trade association, they don't have the time to participate in those working groups, whereas Google, for example, might have the time and resources to do that. So one thing that I've started to kind of like think in a new way, that it's actually even a larger group than we might think, this kind of like, if we think about these aristocrats and then this kind of other end as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just as a mini thing, I think the discussion between what is labor and what is capital as a category to analyze, where are the lines of conflict, where are we looking at? I think this is something that has now for a long time been a big question. Do we think about data as property? Do we think about data as labor? Do we think with a labor theory of value about what is happening in the digital economy, or is that the wrong way to think about it? Can we approximate it with what we have known? And I think none of these things hold properly, and I think that's one of the big reasons why we are a bit struggling in understanding where to orient and which direction to look. And I mean, this sounds very high academic, but I really mean it. At the core is what theory of value is underwriting this digital economy in a sense. How can we make sense of it? Who is benefiting where? Where is the fault line? Who is standing on which part of this fault line? And I think this is something where the idea that you have something like labor in data only gets you so far.
Do you feel exploited when you have hundreds of cookies on your telephone and there's constantly somebody looking over your digital shoulder and that data is sucked out and disappears in some corporate algorithms that maybe tries to sell you stuff through ads on websites you visit? Does that feel like really personally, does it feel like exploitation or like, well, yeah, that's just 2024?
I mean, I'm more on that's just 2024 in a sense. On the data battle side, I feel like I have completely given up the battle in that sense. But what I do say is, again, to come back to the world of crypto, NFTs, and things like that. I mean, as a mini example, I co-founded a not-for-profit organization working on ecology technology interface, so to speak. And just to give a mini example, we worked a lot in the crypto world, where you have then people buy NFTs and you see these transactions and you see where the money goes and so on. We did one collaboration with a Web2 metaverse, one of the biggest gaming metaverses, a Dutch company. And we had zero understanding of what happens within the economy of that game. So there are virtual currencies in the game. You have no idea of how the virtual currency relates to the fiat currency, to the dollar, euro, whatever it is. So they sold 124,000 of those items that were supposed to generate funding for a biodiversity steward organization. We thought, oh my God, jackpot, we did it. And at the end of the day, they said, okay, the first 30% of this go to the new sovereign, which is Google, because the app is on the App Store, so 30% has to go there. That was not even in the contract. It is so known industry knowledge that you don't even have to stipulate it in a contract anymore. And then we had, at the end of the day, like 2,000 euros or something from a sales of like 124,000 items. You think how does this work? And you have no possibility of looking into that. So I think this is more where I see, like, where is the exploitation is really like, what's the the platform economy that drives that, but it's a black box. It's impossible to understand how that trades.
Yeah. Willy, you said earlier, you talked about states, jurisdictions, and maybe we need to look beyond corporations and the state. There does seem to be, not least when it comes to AI, however, so like an increasing actually convergence or interconnection between some government's interests and big tech interests as some of these technologies become increasingly either used in military context or governments see them as really relevant to their national security. We talked earlier about, you talked about graphic processing units, companies like NVIDIA, enormous export restrictions here in the Netherlands. ASML, as a company that makes the machines that you need to make these kinds of computer chips, basically has been forbidden to sell its most advanced machines to China. So all of a sudden you see a situation where what was this happy, anarchical, funny, quirky internet, has been really increasingly drawn into the logics of, in particular, Sino-American competition. And so when we talk about, okay, what's happening to big tech, do we need the state to move in? Is there maybe some third way, grassroots, or small businesses, or crypto all the way, or whatever? How does this whole geopolitics of big tech or geopolitics of digital technology play into that and what we see coming at us in the future?
Yeah, I think that's super fascinating because in a way when we're saying, sometimes when we say, we need to make big tech accountable to the state. Government really needs to stamp down. I think here in Europe we need to be careful when we make those statements, because the government that does seize control of the tech might not be our government. It might be the US and Chinese governments, because we don't actually have most of those companies. And then we end up doing our business not just on Mark Zuckerberg's platform, but on US and Chinese government cyber territory. And I'm not sure that's great either. So there is this idea of that these digital superpowers are weaponizing the tech companies. But I think there's two kind of possible outs for us here as Europeans. One is that, well, the companies and the shareholders that we discussed, they don't necessarily want to be weaponized. It's not really good for your business if you come to be known as an extension of some country's security apparatus. That really sort of upsets the foreign clients. So some of them may be quite ready to kind of strike deals with Europeans, for instance, European governments, in some ways against even their national government's interest in terms of shielding data, locating data in European data centers and shielding it against US warrants. The other thing that that can happen escapes my mind right now, so I'll get back to that one later.
So I have another card that I can sort of like pull from my back pocket here, and that would be, the problem isn't big tech, it's American big tech. So what we need, and I think that's a common refrain in Brussels, is we need European big tech. And then it's going to be fine, or we need Dutch big tech or something. So Matti, maybe to you, when you walk around Brussels, so you talk to the, I won't name names, but to the Googles and Microsofts and God knows what of this world, but also to other people, to trade associations, to civil servants, to civil society organizations, how strong or not strong is this, oh, we need European big tech? That's going to be the answer. Is it something that you come across a lot?
Not really. Not that I would have really asked specifically on whether people want it or not. So of course then they would have answered something, but it hasn't really come up spontaneously, not that much. But of course it relates to this like big other debates we have on innovation policy and industrial policy in Europe, and how to match the kind of massive investments that the Biden government has been doing in innovation policy, and the kind of playbook of post-World War II European and American kind of industrial policy that China has been following since the 1980s. So of course that is a big debate on its own, which is a bit separate from today's topic, but kind of interlinked.
Okay, so to push you a little bit there, the Ursula von der Leyen, still Commission President right now, 4 years ago she said, that digital sovereignty, that was supposed to be one of the lodestars of European policymaking. We need to become digitally sovereign. And as somebody who studies European AI policy, one of the key things there, if you go through all the strategy documents of the European Commission, is what we need is AI made in Europe, right? Because in that way we will not depend on OpenAI, we will not depend on DeepMind, which is now part of Google, or Anthropic, or whomever else. What we need is AI made in Europe. We need digital made in Europe. But if I understand you correctly, like this discourse, which was heavily pushed from different corners of the European Commission and also the European Parliament, that's not something that apparently keeps the American tech companies that you talk to awake at night. That they feel like what is around the corner, that they're going to be kicked out because we have a Europe first policy, or a Make Europe Great Again in digital space.
I mean, as you said in the beginning, like the list of like biggest companies and how few of them are European there.
Yeah, none.
Yeah. So there's quite a distance that like Europe would need to kind of catch up in order to be kind of like seriously in that, okay, how many are in top 10 or something like that. So I think the timescales also matter here, that even if Europe now would do like massive investments of building some kind of foundation for such European champions to emerge, I mean, it wouldn't happen overnight, or it wouldn't happen like maybe not even this decade, or maybe at some point in the future.
So has that ship sailed?
So I think the problem with the digital sovereignty discourse is that it's focusing on Europe's weaknesses and then saying, let's invest lots of money into trying to catch up in those areas where we are really bad at. But instead, if we focused on those areas where we are really good at and where others are actually already dependent on us, because you brought up ASML. So it turns out there's a Dutch company that's like super pivotal in the entire AI race. And it never occurred to anyone in Europe to use that as any sort of bargaining chip or leverage, or even bring that up in negotiations that, by the way, this goes both ways. And we may be dependent on Facebook for liking our friends' cat videos, but you're also dependent on our photolithography machine. So maybe let's be friends here and let's not try to extort each other here, right? But instead, what happens is the U.S. State Department calls ASML and says, "Hey, we're weaponizing you now into our tech war with China," and why is Europe not using its assets? In Finland, Nokia, Sweden, Ericsson, the U.S. Telecommunications sector is completely dependent on these two European companies. A German company in Waldorf called SAP, you may have heard of it. Half of the U.S. economy and much of the Chinese economy runs on that particular platform. So I think the next commission needs to shift from this defensive digital sovereignty discourse into a more assertive sort of European strategic strengths discourse and bring those onto the table.
Andrea, when you hear this, right, so here is, and I also tend to be in that camp that's like maybe naively, I think what we need is somehow, mega, I guess, make Europe great again in the digital space sort of thing. What do you make of that? Because it seems in a way to be exactly what you described as possibly the worst case scenario, like the further integration and fusion of corporate power and government's powers, like an government, digital, industrial, whatever complex brewing together. That's the opposite of maybe where we should be going if we want tech to be a liberating force. Or is that... I don't know how...
I mean, I do think that often the threat scenario becomes so dominant that the discourse really reduces into, okay, so either it's going to be a European giant tech or it's going to be American or Chinese. This is your choice. Choose now. And this is it, and this is all you have on the table. But I do think really like the slogan, Make Europe Great Again, is something that is really, it resonates so strongly because it says so much. So the whole conversation has been condensed to as if the world consists of only these places, no? And the rest of the world has been eradicated from the map, which is not the first time that we have something like that. So I do think it is very important to not fall into the temptation of just saying what is our straw, and also who are we? Again, like in which kind of relationship am I to the state system? Like I'm enrolled into this European citizenship for sure, but nevertheless, there are so many things that states do and operate with that I want to be civil society. I'm not a state representative in that sense, and I think that thinking across the lines of civil society organizing and how that can go is a proposition to take. And I do think that really also in a north-south divide, I think there is a lot of missing pictures, of missing places from this picture. I'm not a expert on tech conversations on the global south, but I do think that this is something that needs to be considered. How can we think of maybe, and here comes my international law background nevertheless is there a mechanism of reciprocity? Is there something, we are seeing struggles around what is the global commons, no? If you look into the seabed, if you look into outer space, not to draw that too far, that line, but there is a question of what is public goods, what is commons, and how can that be organized in different ways. So I do think keeping that open is extremely important. And I also think that thinking historically, as you invited us at the beginning, is something where we see a lot of similarities. No, I find it really like ASML now as the semiconductor Dutch company, think of Royal Dutch Petroleum. I mean, this has been a core company in the Dutch governance landscape, and if you look at the history of oil and how it was developed and what it did and into what kind of dependency on carbon it led us and where we are now, like there's a lot to be learned from this, also in how to organize otherwise, the non-aligned movement, like all of these propositions. I think this is something that can definitely be supported from a European civil society perspective.
Yeah. I mean, one of the studies that I did recently was looking into how the European Commission itself defined digital sovereignty with respect to AI. Because Europeans, I guess we, most of us here in this room, like they tend to think of themselves as the do-gooders on the global scene, like who've learned from their terrible histories, colonial histories, and that they are really the force for good, where otherwise we have the greedy corporate Americans and authoritarian Chinese, and the Europeans think that they're the better people on this planet. And so I've looked into these policies to see whether it is indeed the case that there's any sign at all that European digital policies should also be designed taking into account the footprint that they will have in the global south, that we should think about what fair technology sharing would look like, that we would think about what the environmental impact is of mining rare earths in the south, all of these things, and what you find is absolutely nothing. The reverberations that European policy has with respect to the people who are, as it were, sort of like even on lower rungs of the digital ladder than Europe is completely out of the picture, and it's only sort of like looking up to the main competitors there. There's a final question before I want to open up all to you that I want to put on the table, because I think there's a completely different avenue that we haven't explored yet when we think about, whether big tech concentration is a problem and what potential emancipation for it could be. I was in San Francisco 2 weeks ago, and I was struck to see that there were Waymos, autonomous cars on the streets that would be driving up and down there. Just a week prior to that, I had talked to somebody who works for Volkswagen in the autonomous driving section, and there people were extremely anxious because they were saying, like, we're behind when it comes to autonomous vehicles. We kind of struggle to catch up, and there's all these rules in Germany. We can't try this stuff on the street. San Francisco, turns out they're on the street, and it really felt like, oh, wow. Like it or not, like they're really steps ahead. But then when I came back to Amsterdam, I was struck, well, maybe we don't have autonomous cars, but we have bikes. And I mean that very seriously. In the United States, you have a society where biking across the street is life-threatening. How beautiful is it to live in a place that doesn't need autonomous cars because we can cycle? And it's not something that we can take as a given, right? This is really, I think we're in an exceptionally lucky place that we can move around this space in such a nice way, and we don't need all these cars. What that means is maybe there is also certain societal achievements where this dependency on big tech is not like, oh, we all need to go down that same path of digitizing our societies all the way down, and then indeed we end up depending on American tech. But maybe there are certain ways where we can say, well, maybe we don't need tech 24 hours a day. Maybe there are certain aspects of our lives. Maybe we can run our hospitals in a way where we don't rely on robots left, front, and center, but we just keep humans in there and we pay them well. And that's going to be our healthcare system. It's not just automated everywhere. So I wonder whether, simply to ask how you feel about that, how much agency, how much room is there to somehow choose bottom up what kind of digitization we want in society, and maybe in that way keeping some of these grand influences that we see in check here. Is that a way to counter what feels like a rising threat over there?
That's a tricky question. I don't know if I can answer that directly, but I think one thing that we are lacking as European Union is this kind of strong, kind of like long historical background in terms of like tackling corporate power, because I mean, European Union has been quite this ordo-liberal movement, and we hadn't have this kind of politicization of corporate power or tradition of it in the European level. And in that sense, there's certain advantage in the United States, because I mean they had as a country the kind of oil barons and railroad barons and so on, and kind of critical discussions on those titans of industry in the early 1900s. So there is this kind of like a tradition of mobilization against this these giants of industry there that we lack here. And I think that has really kind of hampered this kind of civil society mobilization, although I think I am watching it a bit more from this kind of like policy perspective, whereas your question was perhaps more on level of kind of individual choices, if I got it right.
Or maybe social, societal choice. You know, maybe if we're worried that there is too much foreign big tech influence in AI, maybe the way to go is to say, well, maybe we just don't put too much AI into our lives. Or is that a pipe dream?
I mean, so I am not a big fan of a theory of change that is built on like abstention and do good. I don't think that will fly in the long term. So this is where I think that when we come back again, what I mentioned before, the absence of a theory of value doesn't mean necessarily only that there is no account of what is labor and what is capital these days. That is missing. But also what is valuable and what is of value in a certain way. So I think that there is a need to enable people to be on a path in which they are improving their life. No? So I think that's also where the promise of upward mobility has been broken utterly. Now, latest, I think you can say that for sure. I have master students that I'm teaching, they are in their third master. It's like, how many can you possibly do before you have to face the fact that somehow the job market is not working for you? So I think this is something that is really in your face. So the question of what promise of collective life securing can be put forward that would allow to move away from this race upward and race after what the technology companies are suggesting. I think that is the big challenge of the day. And that's why, in a sense, I'm so interested in these bottom-up, weirdo crypto communities, tiny, that do token experiments in different versions. So it's a bit there where I think they bring all the pieces to the puzzle. So that's, yeah.
Any thoughts on this?
I think that it's, Europe's facing a demographic problem. There is an economic sustainability problem. We're getting older. We do need to get more economically productive also to be able to maintain our living standard, even the current living standards. I think we do need to embrace labor-saving technologies. This is another term for automation and AI. Whether it needs to be in the specific form that is, proposed by a particular company, no. And then besides obtaining the benefits of automation in order to increase overall welfare, you also do have to take care of the redistribution of that welfare. So in Europe, the main problem is generating the economic surplus. In US, the main problem is redistributing it. And in Europe, the kind of threat scenario is that, our kind of social model collapses because we can no longer fund those social rights that we are used to enjoying. In US, the threat scenario is some kind of political disintegration because society just disintegrates into misinformation and inequality. And that's also not a great outcome. Like, yay, we're super technologically, we have self-driving cars, and also we have like riots on the rioters, sort of. Self-driving cars kind of learn how to weave around the rioters or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. I want to open up to the floor here. So we're open for taking comments, questions. As you would expect, I would ask you to keep it somewhat short. But if you have observations on any of these things, so I see a question or a comment there in the middle. Yes, there is a microphone coming your way.
Hello. Thanks for organizing and thanks for your observations. It's quite enlightening. One topic I don't think you have tackled or started to tackle is the difference between the digital and AI from a point of view of commercial and technological versus from the point of view of knowledge. I am fully with all of you about the fact that concentration is not per se a problem for infrastructure, but concentration of the power on knowledge, that to me is a major threat. I give you a simple example. Netflix can choose when to make movies disappear. This type of power is actually extending further and further. Also on books, Amazon can choose which books are no longer in circulation. don't you think in this particular instance that regulation, even if it's territorial, can do something to protect the greater good?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah.
I could briefly address that. So I would certainly agree, and I think already before the digital era, there have been regulations to limit concentration of media ownership for that very specific reason, right? Like even if it would be more efficient economically that there was a single newspaper distributing all the news, we understood already before that this is not great for a democratic society, and therefore it was prevented. And I think we ought to do that, and people are trying to do that. The trouble is the whole transnational platforms versus nationally, territorially organized political power.
But do you guys recognize the worry that was articulated there, that even if it's maybe still possible, if you dig really hard to find that movie or that book somewhere, that de facto for 99% of the people, like there's enough stuff on Netflix to begin with, nobody looks further than that, right? You know, or whatever streaming platform you subscribe to, that there is still a fence that is de facto put around the easy enough to access knowledge. You know, that's the way I sort of understand you. And then, yes, the other stuff, it's not forbidden, and it's not completely gone, but like it's de facto that there is there's like a funnel in terms of like how things are narrowed down through these de facto corporate filters.
Yeah, I think one aspect is that the European Union has made it more difficult now for this kind of preferencing in these digital platforms. So, I mean, it has been kind of acknowledged as a problem, but of course, I mean, the solutions are always kind of bit watered down versions, so they don't really kind of tackle that particular Netflix, for example. But I think we also need to kind of reinvent, for example, public broadcasting systems. I mean, that was in the 1900s kind of a major solution to this kind of dominance of private interests in the media landscape, as well as various kind of support mechanisms for like local newspapers and such. And I think that kind of debates, at least in my home country, it's mostly the debate is about like, okay, whether and how much should we cut funding from the public broadcasting company and that kind of things, whereas we should be thinking of like what would this kind of public broadcasting look in the 2020s and go into 2030s and so on in the digital world. And that is something that can also be done on the member state level. You don't need the European Union necessarily for that. So I mean, those are some of the debates where we really need kind of this political imagination as well, and to put forward bold proposals on how could we tackle the power of Netflixes and others.
The person who won the elections in the Netherlands, I'm sure everybody knows here, actually proposed indeed doing the exact opposite of refunding the National Broadcasting Service, but Geert Wilders obviously wants to pull the plug on the whole thing altogether, the defunding the NPO for the Dutch here in the audience. So we have a similar movement as what you have in Finland, that actually, and I think the bigger point is there that the knowledge itself has become so politicized in many ways, right? You know, what is correct knowledge, what is appropriate knowledge, what should we serve to our school children, such that even something like public broadcasting has become so politicized, that one drastic solution in some place, I think that speaks what you described, but here in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, who won the election, has similar plans to seriously downscale the funding there and then leave the field wide open to others. But Andrea, I don't know whether you also, it's still something you wanted to add?
I think it's a field in which there's tension. No, on the one hand, I think if the states are being strengthened, and if we speak of things like Make Europe Great Again and the like, and if we see a rise in right-wing governments and in conservative governments, the strength of the public broadcasting system might be in question, and then you might be happy that you have private alternatives to that. So I think it's a tension in that, where and how to play with it. I think I would have to think more about how to go, but I understand the funneling thing. But I do think if the national broadcasting thing becomes the alternative, maybe also not quite comfortable.
Can I just say that the AI is a really interesting case here, because large language models and in general generative AI models, from an economic perspective, it may not be necessary or desirable to have more than one or two foundation models, because it takes so much compute, just so much energy to train a really good model. And basically then everyone should just be versioning off of that foundation model to make specific applications. But the trouble is, if we do that, then the sort of values embedded and encoded into the particular way in which that model, let's say, OpenAI's ChatGPT, was trained, then those end up shaping entire discourse of the planet, right? And so as a counter to that, now different countries and organizations are training sort of national large language models. In Finland, there is Poro, which is means reindeer, and is trained using this European high-performance computing initiatives, Lumi supercomputer in Kajaani. And it is a significant thing, but it's not nearly as good. So it's not clear what is the way to fight. It's like, are we going to then decide that from now on we're going to invest very large amounts of taxpayer money into buying GPUs from NVIDIA, which are manufactured in Taiwan, in order to train chatbots that are comparable in level to what Sam Altman makes. So it gets. I'm not sure what the correct public policy response, but like if there isn't a response, then from an economic perspective, the concentration is going to continue, I think.
Yeah. Let's see whether we have more. I see there at the very back. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Hi, thanks for your talk. I want to go back to a few points you made about media concentration. So my research focuses actually on media concentration and the challenges with platforms and AI and so on. And I think just a quick comment on that, what I find most interesting or most challenging actually is that you say there is media concentration law in place, but actually you see now that larger media organizations, they build closer ties, partnerships with AI companies, which leads to even more concentration within the media sector. So you have like two concentrations taking place at the same time. On the one hand, between the media sector and platforms who have built like some similarities to media companies, you can say. But then you have even greater divergences between media companies themselves. And as part of my research, I did some interviews with media organizations. And most of the larger organizations actually argued that we should get rid of media concentration law so the media sector itself can create a greater counterpower against AI companies, against big tech and platforms and so on. So I think what is often forgotten in the context of media concentration, digital media concentration law, is the role of how to protect local journalism, regional journalism, community, minority journalism, and so on, in the light of all of these concentrations. So, I just want to make that comment because I feel like it's often tackled on a bit of a broader level, like how can you deal with, how can media companies who do have a say in Brussels maybe as well, how can they represent their interests, but often like smaller organizations that don't even get their voices heard properly, they're often forgotten also, for instance, in the European Media Freedom Act and so on. Yeah. I don't think they're really...
And so maybe we can make that one size larger, right? Because I think, as you say, is we have a high concentration in the AI world, and if I understand you correctly, like one way to think about this would be maybe companies with whom these AI companies interact, maybe they should also start teaming up, and maybe not only media companies, but maybe also car manufacturers or publishing houses or music houses or whatever else, so that we sort of like across different economic sectors that we would have sort of like economic counterpower, but so there would be like a leveling up, you would see all of a sudden concentration and response everywhere. So maybe with this media example specifically, but also in others, is there also a danger in this kind of concentration that we see that this highly concentrated sector starts dominating other, in the first instance, seemingly unrelated sectors, right? That it branches out into, we talked about energy provision, for example. Microsoft and Google invest heavily in energy startups, basically positioning themselves as the managers of the smart grid of the future here in the Netherlands and elsewhere, right? So it's not only something that happens in the media world, but in many related sectors where you could exploit the knowledge and expertise that you have and then start, I don't want to say colonizing, but like branching out into related sectors. So what do we do with that? Is there that we need to level up the counterpower from those sectors or maybe something else altogether?
Well, first of all there has been like a big failure in competition policy in different countries. And that's, I mean, policymakers have started to wake up to this both in the United States and in Europe increasingly as well, that throughout the 2010s, many of these companies that grew to become kind of quite influential in digital markets, they were not making profits, and because they were not making profits, they were not in the scope of this kind of competition policy, kind of merger controls and so on. So that was a big failure. There's been a big kind of wake-up call to that, but there is still a long way to go. I'm not an expert in media policy, but if I remember right, there is, for example, in Sweden, there is this kind of a policy, or at least has been, that there has to be at least 2 newspapers in every area of Sweden. And I guess like we could have those kinds of rules in different countries, and I know it's really an uphill struggle in this political environment where kind of like media is being attacked from many different directions, both politically as well as the business models are in danger. So this kind of support for independent media is not kind of like the number one priority in many countries and debates, but it's still something that we need to pursue, I think, in many, like through many different channels.
I'll just briefly say that there's been this push for antitrust reform in the US, right? That antitrust tools would be used to attack concentration in tech and other sectors, but that hasn't really gone anywhere. And now we've got just, 2 weeks ago, this report from Italian economist Letta and also Mario Draghi wading in and saying that actually we need to do the opposite in Europe, which is to stop antitrusting our companies and let them become also so big that they can be an effective competitor in the global stage. So I don't know.
Okay, so here we have somebody. Let's maybe collect a few. So maybe you right there, indeed, and then we'll give you the word as well. Yes, go ahead.
Speakers, very impressive. So as you mentioned before, so we are ending this foundation model era. And to do these foundation models, we need concentration of hardware, electricity, and the computational power. So it's not like, so maybe the basic idea of all the models are all the same, but you do need the resources to moderate the model in an actual way, like the ChatGPT, right? So if you're not tech giant, it's nearly impossible for small companies to do so. So if we are facing this situation from a regulation perspective, does this become impossible, or is it even harder to do things to these tech giants or to deconcentrate this kind of company? It's not like just to how to crack down the Rockefeller empire, the Morgan, things like that. So this become a more sad or bad situation for us, or do we on a regulation level, can we do something else to make it better? So thank you.
All right, thanks. And maybe we'll also like follow up right with you here in front, so we can collect a few. No, but that's fine. Then we can collect. Want to make sure that we hear a few. Whoops, watch out! A few voices from the audience as well.
I think there is a lot we can do, and I didn't hear too much about it. Individually, we can always decline cookies. We can be conscious never to, download apps when it's not absolutely necessary. You have to know that every app is a privacy undermining app. So if the NS says, download the app, they actually say, download the privacy undermining app. Don't do it. And then on the level of companies, there should be competition. And there, of course, there is the thing of economies of scale, how to deal with that. But there can be industrial policies by states or by the European Union. And also, when one of these tech giants really makes misuse of their power, then of course there can be organized an alternative. In Russia, they had V-Kontakte instead of Facebook. Of course, we can do something like that in Europe. But if Facebook doesn't make misuse of their power, we don't do it, of course. But it can happen with all these tech giants. Yeah. So we can do a lot of things, and there are many. And also the thing of regulation. Of course, we need antitrust regulation. And there is it's what we see in the Netherlands. There are 2 owners of all the newspapers. It's ridiculous, and the state is not doing anything about it. Of course, we need it. So, and what are all these public affairs consultants doing in Brussels and in the Netherlands? They have these bullshit stories that we don't need regulations for media. It's ridiculous. Don't buy it. There are so many things we can do. But I leave it. I've many other ideas, but I leave it now.
All right, yeah. Thanks. I think one of the alternatives that we hadn't touched upon so far is open source, right? So maybe when I think of the way in which, one of the threads that comes out of this conversation is that on a certain level it makes sense to have relatively large tech organizations, because of the enormous economies of scale that are involved, like there it makes sense to have large organizations, also when it comes to training models, for example, but maybe also when it comes to managing relatively complex parts of infrastructures. For example, for the management of a smart electricity grid, that's kind of difficult if you have a gazillion small companies where everybody works on an individual node. Like if you really want the large electricity grid to work well in the name of sustainability, then having maybe a large integrated system potentially run by a single company or by a few of them might actually make sense. So something we haven't discussed yet, maybe as a step outside of this, is the question whether maybe open source models might be a way out, in the sense that you have one company, several companies that develop foundation models, but then they may be arm-twisted potentially in a position where they have to make them available to other actors, potentially also to governments, who could then, within their own authority, do with them what they need to do, and they wouldn't be locked into a particular kind of ecosystem, but would still maintain a modicum of authority and autonomy over how these things are used. Do you feel that there is something to this open source alternative? Does it have some traction to get at the problems that we just heard about, to get out of this stranglehold that maybe some big companies have on this field?
I mean, maybe I can begin. I think that indeed open source for sure is a fantastic idea and should be also inscribed in as many ways as possible, and this can bear a lot of fruits. But I think that what cannot be forgotten is that the parallel game to open source is standardization. So you have open source on the one hand, but you still have a drive towards standardization. This is again where in the crypto universe you see that very intensely, because you have new things coming up. What is the NFT standard? It's an ERC20 token, and then it changes into a different format with new abilities, but you need a standardization across the board in order to make it possible. And then the question becomes, whose standard is it that is going to be the one that wins the game? So I think open source is extremely important and allows for a lot of innovation and allows for a lot of decentralized innovation. So people pick up the thing and you leave a copy left in, and it needs to continue like this. But I do think that it's not open source in and of itself doesn't do the job. One, if you don't think through what's the business model and how does it work around that open source. And two, is really the process of standardization as to what will be becoming the key element in whatever value chain that is being built up. And so I do think, I also think, just to be very clear, I think that the question of do we need regulation in this or not is, yeah, absolutely we do need regulation in this, but I don't think it's the only thing that we need, and I don't think we should be putting all of our eggs into the basket of the state.
I think open source in the sense of source code is what Amazon, Meta, Google are based on. They are running, all their servers are running Linux or Linux derivatives. So open source in itself, by itself, is not a challenge to big tech power, and particularly when the concentration is based on these material economies of scale. You can't open source a physical infrastructure. What you're talking about, to me, sounds more like public ownership. You're saying open weights, not just the source of the algorithm that was used to train the model, but the actual outcome of the training, into which hundreds of millions of euros worth of electricity and GPU depreciation capital expenses was poured in. Now there is this object. Can we compel a company to disclose? I suppose, but then nobody's going to develop one of those anymore. If I think you have to basically buy it from them and place it into public ownership. You could do that.
Well, but I mean, but you made the comparison early on, and we won't delve too deeply into that. But with, say, utilities in the provision of water, for example, right? You know, where we have public-private partnerships of different forms in different places of how we ensure provision of public goods, you know, thinking of them as critical infrastructures, thinking of them as utilities, and different countries have different solutions as to how they do that, but these are more than just well-regulated markets, right? You know, often public authorities are still deeply more in there, even when they're not completely publicly owned, and say, for example, you know, these companies can offer some services at different price levels for different kinds of customers, depending on whether they're serving the municipality or private companies or these sorts of things. So I was wondering, if we're saying, well, you know, completely private ownership, do what you want, is maybe not great, but we also feel that completely public ownership is also not the way, whether there is a way somewhere in between where you would say, we would still need companies that would be willing to invest in these things, pay all this money to train these algorithms, but at least that some derivatives of these things would then have to be handed over. Yes, it would take arm twisting, for sure, but considering the alternatives, still wondering whether there was something there.
I think at least much of the platform work, it's very much kind of work that's in the past eras has been very much kind of cooperative, kind of like done in cooperatives, like this kind of collectives of people coming together and kind of sharing a common kind of economic mission or whatever you want to call it. And I think that would be a great kind of model for much of this platform work. But of course then the challenge is that how do you build something in such a scale that you have these ride-hailing apps and others that would work on a cooperative basis and then make it work economically as well, because many of these platforms have actually been making losses.
Yeah. One final question for you before I invite you all, and you all obviously, to drinks there. If you had your druthers and there was like one thing that you would like to see happen, that you would like to see companies do, or citizens do, or governments do, or us as academics do or something, you had one button that you could push and something would happen somewhere, like a different law gets passed in Brussels, or there's a change of mind, or whatever it is. What would that be? You know, if you think about the future and potential problems and solutions to corporate concentration and rising AI, what would be your favorite thing that you'd like to, like if you had a wish for Christmas or Santa Claus or whoever else, what would you wish for? What would be a nice, doesn't have to be the one development, but a nice, what would feel like a genuine step forward?
That we would have like genuine global governance of these companies, like in the United Nations, preferably. That would also involve like global South countries, and that would be like really effective.
Okay, I'll tell Santa Claus, that's one.
I think I'm going to go from the exact opposite direction. It's funny, no? I should be pledging for the UN system. I think I would wish for no more than 1.5x return on any investment for anyone. So access to capital becomes available to everyone, and you can't extract more than whatever, 0.5 times the money that you put in, and then it goes away. So that would be, for me, enabling people to access capital will change the game in many, many ways.
All right.
Well, this is a very small one, but make sure that antitrust law, competition law, if you can't use it to break concentration, at least make sure that it doesn't prevent small businesses and solo entrepreneurs from getting together and collectively negotiating with the platforms, because at the moment that might be judged as a cartel and therefore illegal.
All right, I'll write all those things down here, pass them on to whatever higher authority there is, and maybe hear your words. In the meantime, please join me in thanking our three fantastic speakers here this evening. Thanks to the three of you. And as I said, if you want to find out what Andrea actually meant, that nobody should earn more than 50% extra on their capital investment, at least that's what I got from that, and how she's going to make that happen, do meet her over there at the wine bar. Thanks all to you for coming. You're invited for a drink. It's on the house, on us, on the taxpayer, however you want to think about it. And see you all next time. Thank you very much.